part 2. As always, let me know if any of the audio is messed up. We should be good to go though. So, part 2, the country of the saint. Chapter 1, on the Great Alkali Plain. In the central portion of the great North American continent, there lies an arid and repulsive desert, which for many a long year served as a barrier against the advance of civilization. From the Sierra Nevada to Nebraska, and from the Yellowstone River in the north to the Colorado upon the south, it is a region of desolation and silence. Nor is nature always in one mood throughout this grim district. It comprises snow-capped and lofty mountains and dark and gloomy valleys. There are swift-flowing rivers which dash through jagged canyons, and there are enormous plants, which in winter are white with snow, and in summer are gray with the saline alkali dust. They all persevere. However, the common characteristics of barrenness, inhospitality, and there are no inhabitants of this land of despair. A band of Pawnees or a Blackfoot may occasionally traverse it in order to reach other hunting grounds, but the hardiest of the braves are glad to lose sight of these awesome plains, and to find themselves once more upon their prairies. The coyote skulks among the scrub, the buzzard flaps heavily through the air, and the clumsy grizzly bear lumbers through the dark ravines, picks up such sustenance as it can amongst the rocks. These are the sole dwellers in the wilderness. In the whole world, there could be no drearier view than that of the northern slope of the Sierra Blanco. As far as the eye can reach stretches the great flat plainland, all dusted over with patches of alkali, and intersected by clumps of the dwarfish chaparral bushes. On the extreme verge of the horizon lie a long chain of mountain peaks, with their rugged summits flecked with snow. In this great stretch of country, there is no sign of life, nor of anything appertaining to life. There is no bird in the steel blue heaven, no movement upon the dull gray earth. Above all, there is absolute silence. Dull as one may, or listen as one may, there is no shadow of a sound that all that mighty wilderness. Nothing but silence, complete and heart-subduing silence. It has been said there is nothing appertaining to life upon the broad plain. That is hardly true. Looking down upon the Sierra Blanco, one sees the pathway traced out across the desert, which winds away and is lost in the extreme distance. It is rutted with wheels and trodden down by the feet of many adventurers. Here and there are scattered white objects which glisten in the sun and stand out against the dull deposit of alkali. Approach and examine them. They are bones. Some large and coarse, others smaller and more delicate. The former have belonged to oxen, and the latter to men. For 1,500 miles one may trace this ghastly caravan route by these scattered remains of those who had fallen by the wayside. Looking down this very scene, there stood upon the 4th of May, 1847, a solitary traveler. His appearance was such that he might have been the very genius or demon of this region. An observer would have found it difficult to say whether he was nearer to 40 or 60. His face was lean and haggard, and the brown parchment-like skin. Wonder if text-to-speech is even working. You want me to read it for you, Brain Buster? Where is text-to-speech? I haven't heard text-to-speech in a million years. Detective Duck. Also, how are you? I don't see any, where's our text-to-speech anyways? I need to know it's actually working, especially at 500 things. Doodly-doo-doo. Well, I raised the price by like 10 times, so. I would like to, I'll refund that one for you. I'm not sure why it's not working. Don't worry about it. I think the sound should be working. Maybe?
This is 3 dog, yeah!
They are in fact working. So I raised up the price, but anyways, sorry. Continuing. Remind me to refund you those points. An observer would have found it difficult to say whether he was nearer to 40 or to 60. His face was lean and haggard, and the brown parchment-like skin was drawn tightly over the projecting bones. His long brown hair and beard were all flecked and dashed with white. His eyes were sunken in his head and burned with the unnatural luster, while the hand which grasped his rifle was hardly more fleshy than that of a skeleton. As he stood, he leaned upon his weapon for support, and yet his tall figure and the massive framework of his bones suggested a wiry and vigorous constitution. His gaunt face, however, and his limbs, which hung so baggily over his shriveled limbs, proclaimed what it was that gave him that senile and decrepit appearance. The man was dying from hunger and from thirst. He had toiled painfully down the ravine and on to this little elevation in the vain hope of seeing some signs of water. Now the great salt plain stretched before his eyes, and the distant belt of savage mountains, without a sign anywhere of plant or tree which might indicate the presence of moisture. And all that broad landscape there was no gleam of hope. North and east and west he looked with wild, questioning eyes, and then he realized that his wanderings had come to an end, and that there, on that barren crag, he was about to die. "Why not here, as well as in a feather bed 20 years hence?" he muttered, as he seated himself in a shelter of the boulder. Before sitting down, he had deposited upon the ground his useless rifle, and also a large bundle tied up in a gray shawl, which he carried slung over his right shoulder. It appeared to be somewhat too heavy for his strength, for in lowering it, it came down on the ground with some little violence. Instantly there broke from the gray parcel a little moaning cry, and from it protruded a small, scarred face with two bright brown eyes and two little bespectacled, dimpled fists. "You've heard me," said a childish voice reproachfully. "I don't have a phone back then." "Have I, though?" the man answered penitently. "I didn't go for to do it." As he spoke, he unwrapped the gray shawl and extricated a pretty little girl of about 5 years of age, whose dainty shoes and smart pink frock with its little linen apron all bespoke a mother's care. The child was pale and wan, but her healthy arms and legs showed that she had suffered less than her companion. "How is it now?" he answered anxiously, for she was still rubbing the towsy golden curls which covered the back of her head. "Kiss it and make it well," she said with perfect gravity, showing the injured part up to him. "That's what Mother used to do. Where's Mother?" "Mother's gone. Guess you'll have to see her before long." "Gone, eh?" said the little girl. "Funny, she didn't say goodbye. She most always did if it's just going over to Auntie's for tea, and now it's been away 3 days. Say it's awful dry, ain't it? Ain't there no water nor nothing to eat?" "No, there ain't nothing, dearie. You just need to be patient a while, and then you'll be all right. Put your head up against me like that, and then you'll feel bullier. It ain't easy to talk when your lips is like leather, but I guess I'd better let you know how the cards lie. What's that you got?" "Pretty things, fine things," cried the little girl enthusiastically, holding up 2 glittering fragments of mica. "When we go back to home, I'll give them to Brother Bob." "You'll see prettier things than them soon," said the man confidently. "Just wait a bit. I was going to tell you, though. You remember when we left the river?" "Oh, yeah." "Well, we reckoned we'd strike another river, you see, but there was something wrong. Compasses, or map, or something, didn't turn up. Water ran out. Just except a little drop, the likes of you and..." "Oh, this voice?" "This voice!" "And you couldn't wash yourself?" interrupted his companion gravely, staring up at his grimy visage. "No, nor drink. And Mr. Bender, he was the first to go, and then Indian Pete, and Mrs. McGregor, and then Johnny Holmes, and dearie, your mother." "And Mother's a deader, too," cried the little girl, dropping her face in her pinafore and sobbing bitterly. "Yeah, they all went, except for you and me, and I thought there would be some chance of water in this direction, so I heaved you over my shoulder, and we tramped it together. Doesn't seem like we could improve matters. There's no mighty small chance for us now." "That mean we're going to die, too?" asked the girl, checking her sobs and raising her tear-stained face. "I guess that's about the size of it." "Why didn't you say so before?" she said, laughing gleefully. You gave me such a fright. Why, of course, now as long as we'll die, we'll be with Mother again. Yes, you will, dearie. And you too. I'll tell her how awful good you've been. I bet when she meets us at the door of heaven with a big pitcher of water and a lot of buckwheat cakes, hot and toasted on both sides like Bob and me was fond of, how long will it be first? I don't know. Not very long. The man's eyes were fixed upon the northern horizon. In the blue vault of the heaven there appeared 3 little specks which increased in size every moment. So rapidly did they approach. Buckwheat cakes, that's what they had back then. They speedily resolved themselves into 3 large brown birds which circled over the head of the 2 wanderers, and then they settled upon some rocks which overlooked them. They were buzzards, the vultures of the west. Humming is the forerunner of death. Cocks and hens, cried the little girl gleefully, pointing to the ill-omened forms, clapping her hands to make them rise. Hey, did God make this country? In course he did, said her companion, rather startled by this unexpected question. He made the country down in Illinois, and he made the Missouri, the little girl continued. I guess if somebody else made the country in these parts, it's not nearly so well done. They forgot the water and the trees. Do you, think of offering prayer? Man asked diffidently. It ain't night yet, he answered. It don't matter. It ain't quite regular, but you don't mind that, you bet. Say over them ones that you used to say every night in the wagon. He was in the plains. Why didn't you say some yourself? The child asked with wondering eyes. I disremember them, he answered. I hain't said none since I was half the height of that gun. I guess it's never too late. You say them out and I'll stand by and it's coming on the choruses. Then you'll need to kneel down, and me too. Like 5, Kitty, she said, laying out the shawl for that purpose. You've got to put your hands up like this. It makes you feel kind of good. It was a strange sight, had there been anything but the buzzards to see it. Side by side in the narrow shawl knelt the 2 wanderers, the little prattling child and the reckless, hardened adventurer. Her chubby face and her haggard, angular visage were both turned up at the cloudless heaven in heartfelt entreaty to the dread being with whom they were face to face, while the 2 voices, the one thin, the other clear, the other deep and harsh, the one thin and clear, the other deep and harsh, united in entreaty for mercy and forgiveness. The prayer finished, they resumed their seat in the shadow of the boulder until the child fell asleep, nestling upon the broad breast of her protector. He watched over her slumber for some time. This is going to get back to Sherlock Holmes at some point, right? But nature proved to be too strong for him. For 3 days and nights he had allowed himself neither rest nor repose. Slowly the eyelids drooped over the tired eyes, and the head sunk lower and lower upon the breast, till the man's grizzled beard was mixed with the gold tresses of his companion, and they both slept the same deep and dreamless slumber. Had the wanderer remained awake for another half hour, a strange sight would have met his eyes.
Enjoy your death trap, ladies.
Appropriate.
What was her problem?
Far away on the extreme verge of the alkali plain, there rose a little spray of dust, very slight at first, hardly to be distinguished from the mists in the distance, but gradually growing higher and broader until it formed a solid, well-defined cloud. This cloud continued to increase in size until it became evident that it would only be raised by a great multitude of moving creatures. In more fertile spots, the observer would have come to the conclusion that one of those great herds of bison which graze upon this prairie land was approaching him. This was obviously impossible in these arid wilds. As the whirl of dust came nearer to the solitary bluff upon which the 2 castaways were reposing, the canvas-covered tilts of wagons and the figures of armed horsemen began to show him through the haze, and the apparition revealed itself as being a great caravan upon its journey for the west. But what a caravan! When the head of it had reached the base of the mountains, the rear was not yet visible on the horizon. Right across the enormous plain stretched the straggling array, wagons and carts, men on horseback and men on foot. I hope so. It's me, Sherlock. I've got Aquafina. Innumerable women who staggered along under burdens, and children who toddled beside the wagons or peeped out from under the white coverings. This was evidently no ordinary party of immigrants, but rather some nomad people who had been compelled from stress or circumstance to seek themselves a new country. There rose through the clear air a confused clattering and rumbling from this great mass of humanity, with the creaking wheels and the neighing of horses. Loud as it was not sufficient to rouse the two tired travelers, wayfarers above them. At the head of the column there rode a score or more of grave, iron-faced men, clad in somber homespun garments and armed with rifles. On reaching the base of the bluff they halted, and held a short council among themselves. "The walls to the right, my brother," said one, a hard-lipped, clean-shaven man with grizzly hair. "The right of the Sierra Blanco, so we shall reach the the Rio Grande," said another. "Fear not for water," cried a third. "He who could draw it from the rocks would not abandon his own chosen people." "Amen, amen," Roardiobooks, responded the whole party. They were about to resume their journey when one of the youngest and keenest-eyed uttered an exclamation and pointed up at the rugged crag above them. From its summit there fluttered a little wisp of pink, showing up hard and bright against the gray rocks behind. At the sight there was a general reining up of horses and upslinging of guns, while fresh horsemen came galloping up to reinforce the vanguard. The word "Redskins" was on every lip. "There can't be any..." I think these are actually Mormons. I think I need to switch up my accents. "There can't be any number of Injuns here," said the elderly man who appeared to be in command. "We have passed the Pawnees, and there are no other tribes until we cross the Great Mountain." "Shall I go forward and see, Brother Strangerson?" asked one of the band. And I," cried a dozen voices. "Leave your horses below, and we will await you here," the elder answered. In a moment, the young fellows had dismounted, fastened their horses, and were ascending the precipitous slopes which led up to the object which excited their curiosity. They advanced rapidly, noiselessly, the confidence and dexterity of practiced scouts. The watchers from the plain below could see them flit from rock to rock, till the figures stood out upon the skyline. The young man who had first given alarm was leading them. Suddenly his followers saw him throw up his hands, as though overcome with astonishment, and on joining him they were affected in the same way by the sight that met their eyes. On the little plateau which crowned the barren hill there stood a single giant boulder, and against this boulder there lay a tall man, long-bearded and hard-featured, but for an excess of thinness. His placid face and regular breathing showed that he was fast asleep. Beside him lay a little child, with her round white arms encircling his brown sinewy neck, and her golden-haired head resting upon his breast of his velveteen tunic. Her rosy lips were... My butt spot. His rosy lips were parted, showing the regular line of snow-white teeth within, and a playful smile played over her infantile features. Her plump little white legs terminated in white socks and neat shoes with shining buckles, offered a strange contrast to the long shriveled members of her companion. On the ledge of rock above this strange couple there stood three solemn buzzards, who at the sight of their newcomers uttered raucous screams of disappointment, flapped sullenly away. I'm guessing the former, Rainbow. The cries of the foul birds awoke the two sleepers, who stared about them in bewilderment. The man staggered to his feet and looked down the plain which had been so desolate when sleep overtaken him, and which had now traversed by this enormous body of men and of beasts. His face assumed an expression of incredulity as he gazed, and he passed his bony hand over his eyes. "This is what I call delirium, I guess," he muttered. The child stood beside him, holding on to the skirt of his coat, and said nothing but looked all around her with the wondering, questioning gaze of childhood. The rescuing party were speedily able to convince the two castaways that their appearance was no delusion. One of them seized the little girl and hoisted her upon his shoulder, while two others supported her gaunt companion and assisted him toward the wagon. "My name is John Ferrier," Wanderer explained. "Me and that little one are all that's left, 21 people. The rest are all dead of thirst and hunger way down the south. Is she your child? Asked someone. I guess she is now, the other cried defiantly. She's mine because I saved her. No man will take her from me. She's Lucy Ferrier from this day on. Who are you, though? He continued, glancing with curiosity at his stalwart, sunburned rescuers. There seems to be a powerful lot of you. Nigh upon 10,000, said one of the young men. We are the persecuted children of God, the chosen of the angel Morona. I never heard tell of him, said the wanderer. He appears to have chosen a fair crowd of you. Do not jest at which is sacred, said the other sternly. We are those who believe in the sacred writings, drawn in Egyptian letters on plates of beaten gold, which were handed upon holy Joseph Smith at Palmyra. We have come from Nabu, in the state of Illinois, which we'd founded our temple. We have come to seek a refuge from the violent man and from the godless, even though it be from the heart of the desert. The name of Nabu evidently recalled recollections of John Ferrier. I see, he said. You are the Mormons. We are the Mormons, answered his companions with one voice. Where are you going? We do not know. The hand of God is leading us under the person of our prophet. You must come before him. We shall say what must be done with you. He shall say what must be done with you. They had reached the base of the hill by this time, and were surrounded by crowds of pilgrims, pale-faced, meek-looking women, strong laughing children, and anxious, earnest-eyed men. Many were the cries of astonishment and of commiseration which arose from them when they perceived the youth of the one of the strangers and the destitution of the other. Their escort did not halt, however, but pushed on, followed by a great crowd of Mormons, until they reached a wagon, which was conspicuous for its great size and for the gaudiness and smartness of its appearance. 6 horses were yoked to it, whereas the others were furnished with 2, or at most 4 apiece. Beside the driver, there sat a man who could not have been more than 30 years of age, but whose massive head and resolute expression marked him as a leader. He was reading a brown-backed volume, but as the crowd approached, he laid it to one side, listened attentively to the account of the episode. Then he turned to the 2 castaways. If we take you with us, he said in solemn words, it can only be as believers in our own creed. We shall have no wolves in our fold. Better far that your bones should bleach in the wilderness than you should prove to be that little speck of decay which in time corrupts the whole fruit. Will you come with us on those terms? I'll come with you on any terms, said Ferrier, with such emphasis that the grave elders could not restrain a smile. Castaways. The leader alone retained his stern, impressive expression. Take him, Brother Strangerson, he said. Give him food and drink, and the child likewise. Let it be in your task also to teach him our holy creed. We have delayed long enough. Forward, on to Zion. On to Zion, cried the crowd of Mormons, and the words rippled down the long caravan, passing from mouth to mouth until they died away in the
If
dull...
you've ever ordered anything from
Time to
Dairy
take a
Queen
drink.
that wasn't ice cream, you deserve to be thrown in a gulag.
Passing from mouth to mouth until they died away in a dull murmur in the far distance. With a cracking of whips and the creaking of wheels, the great wagons got into motion. Soon the whole caravan was winding along once more. The elder to whose care the 2 waifs had committed led him to his wagon, where a meal was already waiting them. You shall remain here, he said. In a few days you will have recovered from your fatigues. In the meantime, remember that you now and forever you are our religion. Brigham Young has said it, and he has spoken with the voice of Joseph Smith, which is the voice of God. Annually, British people eat more than 15 pounds of beans, Fran's pride. Chapter 2. The Flower of Utah. This is not the place to commemorate the trials and privations endured by that immigrant Mormons before they came to their final haven. From the shores of the Mississippi to the western slopes of the Rocky Mountains, they had struggled on with a constancy almost unparalleled in history. The savage man and the savage beast, hunger, thirst, fatigue, and disease, every impediment which nature could provide in its way had all been overcome with Anglo-Saxon tenacity. Yet the long journey and the accumulated terrors had shaken the hearts of the stoutest among them. There was not one who did not sink upon his knees in heartfelt prayer when they saw the broad valley of Utah bathed in the sunlight beneath them, and learned from the lips of their leader that this was the promised land, and that these virgin acres were to be theirs forevermore. Absolutely nothing, Kitty, but that was the emote that Willow decided was going after that fun fact. Also, it's Pride Month, so it's perfectly fine regardless. Young speedily proved himself to be a skillful administrator as well as a resolute chief. Maps were drawn and charts prepared in which the future city was sketched out. All around, farms were apportioned and allotted in proportion to the standing of each individual. The tradesman was put to his trade and an artisan to his calling. In the town, streets and squares sprang up as if by magic. In the country, there was draining and hedging, planting and clearing, until the next summer saw the whole country golden with the wheat crop. Fisher, you okay up there? Come on. Having a rough time doing some fishing. Everything prospered in the strange settlement. Above all, the great temple where they had erected in the center of the city grew ever taller and larger. From the first blush of dawn until the closing of the twilight, the clatter of the hammer and the rasp of the saw were never absent from the monument which the immigrants erected to him who had led them safe through many dangers. The two castaways, John Ferrier and the little girl who had shared his fortunes and had been adopted as his daughter, accompanied the Mormons to the end of their great pilgrimage. Little Lucy Ferrier was borne along pleasantly enough in Elder Strangerson's wagon, a retreat which she had shared with the Mormon's 3 wives and with his son, a headstrong forward boy of 12. Having rallied with the elasticity of childhood from the shock caused from her mother's death, and reconciled herself to her new life in the moving canvas-covered home. In the meantime, Ferrier had recovered himself from his privations, distinguished himself as a useful guide and an indefatigable hunter. So rapidly did he gain the esteem of his new companions that when he reached the end of their wanderings, it was unanimously agreed that he should be provided with as large and fertile a tract of land as any of the settlers, with the exception of Young himself, and of Strangerson, Campbell, Johnston, and Drebber, who were the 4 principal elders. Complete RNG, Kitty. On the farm thus acquired, John Ferrier built himself a substantial log house, which received so many additions in succeeding years that it grew into a roomy villa. He was a man of a practical turn of mind, keen in his dealings and skillful with his trade. His iron constitution enabled him to work morning and evening at improving and tilling the lands. Hence it came about that his farm and all that belonged to him prospered exceedingly. In 3 years he was better off than his neighbors. In 6 he was well-to-do. In 9 he was rich. And in 12 there was not half a dozen men in the whole of Salt Lake City to compare with him. From the great inland sea to the distant Washoe Mountain, there was no name better than that of John Ferrier. There was one way, and only one, in which he offended the susceptibilities of his co-religionists. No argument or persuasion could ever induce him to set up a female establishment after the manner of his companion. He never gave reasons for this persistent refusal, but contented himself by resolutely and inflexibly adhering to his determination. There were some who accused him of lukewarmness in adopted religion, and others who put it down to the greed of wealth and the reluctance to incur expense. Others again spoke of some early love affair and of a fair-haired girl who had pined away on the shores of the Atlantic. Whatever the reason, Ferrier remained strictly celibate. In every other respect, he conformed to the religion of the young settlement and gained the name of being an orthodox, straight-walking. Lucy Ferrier grew up within the long house and assisted her adopted father in all his undertaking. The keen air of the mountains and the balsamic odor of the pine trees took the place of nurse and mother to the young girl. As year succeeded to year, she grew taller and stronger, her cheek more ruddy, and her step more elastic. Many a wayfarer upon the high road which ran by Ferrier's farm felt long forgotten. Thoughts revive in their mind as they watched her lithe, girlish figure tripping through the wheat fields, or met her mounted upon her father's Mustang, and managing it all with the ease and grace of a true child of the West. So the bud blossomed into a flower, and the year which saw her father the richest of all the farmers left her as fair a specimen of American girlhood as could be found in the whole Pacific slope. It was not the father, however, who first discovered that the child had developed into a woman. It seldom is in such cases. That mysterious change is too subtle and too gradual to be measured by dates. Least of all does the maiden know herself, until the tone of a voice or the touch of a hand sets her heart thrilling within her, and she learns, with a mixture of pride and of fear, that a new and larger nature has awoken within her. There are few who cannot recall that day and remember that one little incident which heralded the dawn of a new life. In the case of Lucy Ferrier, the occasion was serious enough in itself, apart from its future influence on her destiny and that of many besides. It was a warm June morning. It was a warm June morning, and the Latter-day Saints were as busy as the bees whose hive they have chosen for their emblem. In the fields and the streets rose the same hum of human industry. Down the dusty high roads defiled long streams of heavily laden mules, all heading for the west, for the gold fever had broken out in California, and the overland route lay through the city of the elect. There, too, were droves of sheep and bullocks coming in from the outlying pasture lands, and trains of tired immigrants. Men and horses were equally weary of their interminable journey. Through all of this motley assemblage, threading her way with the skill of an accomplished rider, there galloped Lucy Ferrier, her fair face flushed with exercise and her long chestnut hair floating out behind her. She had a commission from her father in the city and was dashing in as she had done many a time before, with all the fearlessness of youth, thinking only of her task and how it was to be performed. The travel-stained adventurers gazed after her in astonishment, and even the unemotional Indians, journeying in with their pelties, relaxing their accustomed stoicism as they marveled in the beauty of the pale-faced maiden. She had reached the outskirts of the city when she found the road blocked by a great drove of cattle, driven by half-dozen wild-looking herdsmen from the plain. In her impatience, she endeavored to pass the obstacle by pushing her horse into what appeared to be a gap. Scarcely had she got fairly into it, however, before the beast closed in behind her, and she found herself completely embedded in the moving stream of fierce-eyed, long-horned bullocks. Accustomed as she was to deal with cattle, she was not alarmed at her situation, but took every advantage of every opportunity to urge her horse on in the hopes of pushing her way through the cavalcade. Unfortunately, the horns of one of the creatures, either by accident or design, came in violent contact with the flank of her Mustang, and it excited it to madness. In an instant, it reared up upon its hind legs with a snort of rage, pranced and danced and tossed in a way that would have unseated any but the most skillful rider. The situation was full of peril. Every plunge of the excited horse brought it against the horns again and goaded it to fresh madness. It was all that the girl could do to keep herself in the saddle, yet a slip would mean a terrible death under the hooves of the unwieldy and terrified animal. Unaccustomed to sudden emergencies, her head began to swim, and her grip upon the bridle began to relax. Choked by the rising cloud of dust and by the steam from the struggling creatures, she may have abandoned her efforts in despair, but for a kindly voice at her elbow which had assured her of assistance. Same moment, a sinewy brown hand caught the frightened horse by the curb, and forcing a way through the drove, soon brought her to the outskirts. "You're not hurt, I hope, miss," said her preserver respectfully. She looked up at his dark, fierce face and laughed saucily. "I'm awful frightened," she said naively. "Whoever would have thought that Pancho would have been so scared by a lot of cows?" Thank God you kept your seat, the other said earnestly. He was a tall, savage-looking young fellow, mounted on a powerful roan horse, clad in the young, rough dress of a hunter, a long rifle slung over his shoulder. I guess you are the daughter of John Ferrier, he remarked. I saw you ride down from his house. When you see him, ask him if he remembers the Jefferson Hopes, St. Louis. If he is the same Ferrier, my father and I were pretty thick. Hadn't you better come and ask yourself? She asked demurely. The young fellow seemed pleased at the suggestion, and his dark eyes sparkled with pleasure. Listen, Brainbuster, I don't know what to tell you. I'm sure that Sherlock will be here. That said, Jefferson Hopes is actually from the last book, so we're actually getting something from the last part. I'll do so, he said. We've been in the mountains for 2 months, and we are not over and above in visiting condition. He must take us in as he finds us. He has a good deal to thank you for, and so have I, she answered. He's awful fond of me. If those cows had jumped on me, he'd never got over it. Neither would I, said her companion. You? Well, I don't see how much it'd make it matter to you anyhow. You ain't even a friend of ours. The young hunter's dark face grew so gloomy over this remark that Lucy Ferrier laughed aloud. Oh, there, I didn't mean that, she said. Of course, you're a friend now. You must come and see us. Now, I must push along, or Father won't trust me with his business anymore. Goodbye. Goodbye, he answered, raising his broad sombrero and bending it over her little hand. She wheeled her Mustang round, gave it a cut with her riding whip, and darted away down the broad road in a rolling cloud of dust. Young Jefferson Hope rode on with his companions, gloomy and taciturn. He and they had been among the Nevada mountains prospecting for silver and were returning to Salt Lake City in the hope of raising capital and work some lodes which they had discovered. He had been as keen as any of them upon the business until this sudden incident had drawn his thoughts into another channel. The sight of the fair young girl, as frank and wholesome as the Sierra breezes, had stirred his volcanic, untamed heart to the very depth. When she had vanished from his sight, he realized that a crisis had come into his life, and that neither silver speculations nor any question otherwise could ever be of such importance to him as this new and all-absorbing one. The love which had sprung up in his heart was not the sudden, changeable fancy of a boy, but rather the wild, fierce passion of a man of strong will and imperious temper. He had been accustomed to succeed in all that he undertook, for in his heart that he could not fail in this. Human effort and human perseverance render him. He called upon John Ferrier that night, many times again, until his face was a familiar one at the farmhouse. John, cooped up in the valley and absorbed in his work, had little chance of learning the news of the outside world during the last 12 years. All this Jefferson Hope was able to tell him, and in a style which interested Lucy as well as her father. He had been a pioneer in California, could narrate many a strange tale of fortunes made and fortunes lost in these wild halcyon days. He had been a scout, too, and a trapper, silver explorer, and a ranchman. Wherever stirring adventures were to be had, Jefferson Hope had been there in search of them. He soon became a favorite of the old farmer, who spoke eloquently of his virtue. On such occasions, Lucy was silent, but her blushing cheek and her bright, happy eyes showed only too clearly that her young heart was no longer her own. Her honest father may not have observed those symptoms, but they were assuredly not thrown away upon the man who had won her affection. It was a summer evening when he came galloping down the road and pulled up at the gate. She was at the doorway and came down to meet him. He threw the bridle over the fence and strode up the pathway. I am off, Lucy, he said, taking her two hands in his and gazing tenderly into her face. I won't ask you to come with me now, but will you be ready to come when I am here again? And when will that be? She asked, blushing and laughing. A couple of months at the outside. I will come and claim you then, my darling. There's no one who will stand between us. And how about Father? She asked. He has given his consent. provided we get these mines working all right. I have no fear on that head." "Oh, well, of course, if you and Father had arranged it all, there's no more to be said," she whispered, her cheek against his broad breast. "Thank God," he said hoarsely, stooping and kissing her. "It is settled then. The longer I stay, the harder it will be to go. They are waiting for me in the canyon. Goodbye, my own darling. Goodbye. In 2 months, you'll see me." He tore himself from her as he spoke. Flinging himself upon his horse, galloped furiously away, never even looking round, as though afraid that his resolution might fail him if he took one more glance at what he was leaving. She stood at the gate, gazing after him until he vanished from her sight. And then she walked back into the house, the happiest girl in all Utah. Drop my fish back home. Problem is, if I keep fishing and the fish just drops onto the ground and then the serpent crashes. Chapter 3. John Ferrier talks with the prophet. I'm sure that Sherlock Holmes is coming back at some point. Take a drink. I can't promise because I've got no idea. I'm sure he's got to be coming back. Like, this is part of the first Sherlock Holmes book. Promise. Got to be some Sherlock. Three weeks had passed since Jefferson Hope and his comrades had departed from Salt Lake City. John Ferrier's heart was sore within him when he thought of the young man's return and of the impending loss of his adopted child. Yet her bright and happy face reconciled him to the arrangement more than any argument could have done. He had always determined deep down in his resolute heart that nothing would ever induce him to allow his daughter to wed a Mormon. Such a marriage he regarded as no marriage at all, but as shame and a disgrace. Whatever he might think of the Mormon doctrines, upon that one point he was inflexible. He had to seal his mouth on the subject, however, for to express an unorthodox opinion was a dangerous matter in these days of the land of the saints. Yes, a dangerous matter. So dangerous that even the most saintly dared only whisper their religious opinions with bated breath, lest something which fell from their lips might be misconstrued and bring down a swift retribution upon them. The victims of persecution had now turned persecutors of their own account, persecutors of the most terrible description. Not the Inquisition of Seville, nor the German nor the secret societies of Italy were ever able to put a more formidable machinery in motion than that which cast a cloud over the state of Utah. Its invisibility and the mystery which attached to it made this an organization doubly terrible. It appeared to be omniscient and omnipotent, yet was neither seen nor heard. The man who held out against the church vanished away, and none knew whither he had gone nor what had befallen him. His wife and children awaited him at home, but no father ever returned to tell him how they'd fared at the hands of the secret judges. A rash word or a hasty act was followed by annihilation, yet none knew what the nature of this terrible power which descended over them. No wonder that men which went about in fear and trembling, and that even in the heart of the wilderness they dared not whisper the doubts which oppressed them. First, this vague and terrible power was exercised only upon the recalcitrant, who, when having embraced the Mormon faith, wished afterwards to pervert or abandon it. Soon, however, it took a wider range. The supply of adult women was running short. Polygamy without a female population on which to draw was a barren doctrine indeed. Strange rumors began to be bandied about, rumors of murdered immigrants and rifled camps in regions where Indians had never been seen. Fresh women appeared in the harems of the elders, women who pined and wept, bore upon their faces the traces of an unextinguishable horror. Belated wanderers upon the mountains spoke of gangs of armed men, masked, stealthy, and noiseless, who flitted by them in the darkness. These tales and rumors took substance and shapes, and were corroborated and re-corroborated until they resolved themselves into a definite name. To this day, in the lonely reaches of the West, the name of the Danite Band, or the Avenging Angel, sinister, ill-omened one. Fuller knowledge of the organization which produced such terrible results served to increase rather than lessen the terror which it inspired in the minds of men. None knew who belonged to this ruthless society. The names of the participators in the deeds of blood and violence done under the name of religion were kept profoundly secret. The very friend to whom you communicated your misgivings as to the prophet and his mission might be the one who would come forth at night with fire and sword and exact a terrible reparation. Hence every man feared his neighbor, and none spoke of the things which were nearest his heart. One fine morning, when John Ferrier was about to set upon his wheat fields, when he heard the click of a latch, and looking through the window, saw a stout, sandy-haired, middle-aged man coming up his pathway. His heart leapt to his mouth, for this was none other than the great Brigham Young himself. Full of trepidation, for he knew that such a visit boded him little good, Ferrier ran to the door to greet the Mormon. The latter, however, received his salutations coldly, followed him with a stern face into the sitting room. "Brother Ferrier," he said, taking a seat and eyeing the farmer keenly from under his light-colored eyelashes, "the true believers have been good friends to you. We picked you up when you were starving in the desert. We shared our food with you, led you safe to the chosen valley, gave you a goodly share of land, and allowed you to wax rich under our protection. Is this not so?" "It is so," answered John Ferrier. "In return for this, all we asked was but one condition. That was that you should embrace the true faith, and that you conform in every way to its usages. This you promised to do, and this, if common report says truly, you have neglected." "And how have I neglected it?" asked Ferrier, throwing out his hands in expostulation. "Have I not given to the common fund? Have I not attended at the temple? Have I not—" "Where are your wives?" asked Young, looking round him. "Call them in, so that I may greet them." "It is true that I have not yet married," Ferrier answered. "But women were few, and there were many who had better claims than I. I was not a lonely one. I had my daughter to attend to." "It is of that daughter that I would speak to you," said the leader of the Mormons. "She had grown to be the flower of Utah, and has found favor in the eyes of many who are high in the land." John Ferrier groaned internally. "There are stories of her which would feign disbelief. Stories that she is sealed to some Gentile. This must be the gossip of idle tongues. What is the 13th rule in the code of the sainted Joseph? Let each maiden, the true faith, marry one of the elect. For if she wed a Gentile, she commits a grievous grievance. This being so, it is impossible that you, who profess the Holy Creed, should suffer your daughter to violate it." John Ferrier made no answer, but he played nervously with his riding whip. "Upon this one point, your whole faith shall be tested. So it has been decided in the sacred council of four. The girl is young, and we would not have her wed gray hairs, nor would we deprive her of all choice. We elders have many heifers. Heifers? But our children must also be provided. Strangerson has a son, and Drebber has a son. Neither of them would gladly welcome your father to their house. Let her choose between them. They are young and rich and of the true faith. What do you say to that?" By the way, Heber C. Campbell, in one of his sermons, allude to his 100 wives using this endearing epithet. That's when you say heifers, talking about. That's the subtext. Ferrier remained silent for some little time with his brows knitted. Give us some time," he said at last. "My daughter is very young. She is scarce at an age to marry." "She will have a month to choose," said Young, rising from his seat. At the end of that time, she will give her answer. He was passing through the door when he turned with flushed face and flashing eyes. It were better for you, Don Ferrier, he thundered, that you and she were now lying blanched skeletons upon the Sierra Blanco, that you should put your weak wills against the orders of the Holy Four. With a threatening gesture of his hand, he turned from the door, and Ferrier heard his heavy step crunching along the shingly path. Because power usually does that, Kitty. Generally the easiest thing for powerful people to do. He was still sitting with his elbows upon his knees, wondering how he should broach the matter to his daughter when a soft hand was laid upon his. Looking up, he saw her standing beside him. One glance at her pale, frightened face showed him that she had heard what had passed. "Could not help it," she said, in answer to his look. His voice rang through the house. "Oh, father, father, what shall we do?" "Don't you scare yourself," he said, drawing her to him and passing his broad, rough hand caressingly over her chestnut hair. "We'll fix it up somehow or another. Don't you find your fancy kind of lessening for this chap, do you?" A sob and a squeeze of his hand were his only reply. "No, of course not. I shouldn't care to hear you say you did. He's a likely lad, and he's a Christian, more than one of these folk here, in spite of all their praying. There's a party starting for Nevada tomorrow, and I'll manage to send him a message, letting him know the hole we're in. If I know anything of that young man, he'll be back here with a speed that would whip electro-telegraphs." Lucy laughed through her tears at her father's description. When he comes, he'll advise us for the best, but it is for you that I'm frightened, dear. One hears such dreadful stories about those who oppose the prophet. Something terrible always happens. But we haven't opposed him yet. I think that was the daughter talking. Their father answered, "It will be time to look for squalls when we do. We'll have a clear month before us. At the end of that, I guess we'd best shin out of Utah." "Leave Utah?" "Yes, that's about the size of it." "But the farm?" "We'll raise as much as we can in money. And let the rest go. Tell the truth, Lucy, it ain't the first time I thought of doing it. I don't care about knuckling under to any man as these folks do to these darn prophets." "Shit out of Utah. I'm a free-born American, and it's all new to me. Guess I'm too old to learn. If he comes browsing about this farm, he might chance to run against a chance of buckshot traveling the opposite direction." "But they won't leave us alone," his daughter objected. "Wait till Jefferson comes. We'll soon manage that. In the meantime, don't you fret yourself, my dearie, and don't you get your eyes welled up. Else he'll be walking into me when he sees you. There's nothing to be afeared about, and there's no danger at all." Wait. The end of these chapters drives me nuts. John Ferrier uttered these consoling remarks in a very confident tone. She could not help observing that he paid unusual care to the fastening of the doors that night, and that he carefully cleaned and loaded the rusty old shotgun which hung upon his wall for the bedroom. Chapter 5. Flight for Life. On the morning which followed his interview with the Mormon prophet, John Ferrier went into Salt Lake City. Having found his acquaintance, who was bound for the Nevada mountain, he entrusted him with his message for Jefferson Hope. In it, he told the young man of his imminent danger who threatened him, and how necessary it was that he should return. Having done thus, he felt easier in his mind, and returned home with a lighter heart. As he approached his farm, he was surprised to see a horse hitched to each of the posts of his gate. Still more surprised was he on entering to find two young men in possession of his sitting room. One, with a long, pale face, was leaning back in the rocking chair with his feet cocked up upon the stove. The other, a bull-necked youth with coarse, bloated features, was standing in front of the window with his hands in his pocket, whistling a popular hymn. Both of them nodded to Ferrier as he entered, and the one in the rocking chair commenced the conversation. "Maybe you don't know us," he said. "This here's the son of an elder Drebber. I'm Joseph Strangerson. who traveled with you in the desert when the Lord stretched out his hand and gathered you into the true fold. As he will all the nations in all other good time, said the other in nasal voice. He grindeth slowly but exceedingly small. John Ferrier bowed coldly. He had guessed who his visitors were. We have come, continued Strangerson, at the advice of our fathers to solicit the hand of your daughter, for whichever of us seem good to you and to her. As I have but 4 wives, and Brother Drebber here has 7, it appears to me that my claim is the stronger one. Nay, nay, Brother Strangerson, cried the other. My question is not how many wives we have, but how many we can keep. My father has now given over his mills to me, and I am the richer man. But my prospects are better, said the other warmly. When the Lord removes my father, I shall have his tanning yard and his leather factory, and then I am your elder, and am higher in the church. It will be for the maiden to decide, rejoined young Drebber, smirking at his own reflection in the glass. We will leave it all to her decision. During this dialogue, John Ferrier had stood fuming in the doorway, hardly able to keep his riding whip from the backs of these 2 visitors. Probably not, Kitty. Look here, he said at last, striding up to them. When my daughter summons you, you can come, but until then, I don't want to see your faces again. The 2 young Mormons stared at him in amazement. In her eyes, that's how I see them, Brainbuster. In their eyes, this competition between them for the maiden's hand was the highest of honors, both to her and her father. There are 2 ways out of this room, cried Ferrier. There is the door, and there is the window. Which do you care to use? His brown face looked so savage, and his gaunt hands so threatening, that his visitors sprang to his feet and beat a hurried retreat. The old farmer followed them to the door. Let me know when you've settled which it is to be, said sardonically. You're smart for this, Strangerson cried, white with rage. You've defied the prophet and his counsel of 4. You shall rule it to the end of your days. The hand of the Lord shall be upon you. I don't remember whose voice is who. I need to write these down, cried young Drebber. He shall arise and smite you. Then I'll start the smiting, exclaimed Ferrier furiously, and who would have rushed upstairs for his gun had Lucy seized him by the arm and restrained him. Before he could escape from her, the clatter of horses' hooves told him that they were beyond his reach. Young canting rascals, he exclaimed, wiping the perspiration from his forehead. I would sooner see you in the grave, my girl, than the wife of either of them. And so should I, father, she answered with spirit, but Jefferson will soon be here. Yeah, will not be long before he comes. Sooner the better. We'll not know what their next move will be. It was indeed high time that someone capable of giving advice and help should come to the aid of the sturdy old farmer and his adopted daughter. In the whole history of the settlement, there had never been a case of rank disobedience to the authority of the elders. If minor errors were punished so sternly, then what would be the fate of this arch-rebel? Ferrier knew that the wealth and position would be of no avail to him. Others as well known and rich as himself had been spirited away before now, and their goods given over to the church. He was a brave man, and their goods, but he trembled at the vague, shadowy terrors which hung over him. Any known danger he could face with a firm lip, but this suspense was unnerving. He concealed his fears from his daughter, however, and affected to make light of the whole matter, though she, with the keen eye of love, saw plainly that he was ill at ease. He expected that he would receive some message of remonstrance from Young as to his conduct, and he was not mistaken, though it came in an unlooked-for manner. Upon rising next morning, he found, to his surprise, a small square of paper pinned to the coverlet of his bed just over his chest. On it was printed, in bold, straggling letters, 29 days are given you for amendment, and then... The dash was more fear-inspiring than any threat could ever have been. How this warning came to his room puzzled John Ferrier sorely, for his servant slept in an outhouse, and the doors and windows had all been secured. He crumpled the paper up and said nothing to his daughter, but the incident struck a chill into his heart. The 29 days were evidently the balance of the month which Avail had promised. What strength of the courage would avail him against an army armed with such enemy armed with such mysterious powers? The hand which fastened that pin could struck him in the heart. He never would have known what slayed him. Still more shaken was he the next morning. They had sat down to their breakfast when Lucy, with a cry of surprise, pointed upwards. In the center of the ceiling was scrawled, with a burned stick apparently, the number 28. To his daughter it was unintelligible, and he did not enlighten her. That night he sat up with a gun, kept watch and ward. He saw and heard nothing, and yet in the morning a great 27 had been painted on the outside of his door. Thus day followed day, and as sure as morning came he found that his unseen enemies had kept their register, and had marked up in some conspicuous position how many days were still left to him, the month of grace. Sometimes the fatal numbers appeared upon the walls, sometimes upon the floors. Occasionally they were on small placards stuck upon the garden gate or on the railings. With all his vigilance, John Ferrier could not discover whence these daily warnings proceeded. A horror which was almost superstitious came upon him at the sight of them. He became haggard and restless, and his eyes had the troubled look of some hunted creature. He had but one hope in life now. That was for the arrival of the young hunter from Nevada. 20 had changed to 15, and 15 to 10, but there was no news from the absentee. One by one the numbers dwindled down, and still there was no sign of him. When a horseman clattered down the road or a driver shouted at his team, the old farmer hurried at a gate, thinking that help had arrived at last. At last, when he saw 5 give way to 4 and then again to 3, he lost heart, abandoned all hope of escape. Single-handed, and with his limited knowledge of the mountains which surrounded the settlement, he knew that he was powerless. The more frequented roads were strictly watched and guarded, and none could pass among them without an order from the council. Turn which way he could, there appeared to be no avoiding the blow which hung over him. Yet the old man never wavered in resolution to part with life itself before he consented to what he regarded as his daughter's decision. He was sitting alone one evening, pondering deeply over his troubles and searching vainly for some way out of them. That morning had shown the figure 2 upon the wall of the house, and the next day would be the last of the allotted time. What was to happen then? All manner of vague and terrible fancies filled his imagination. And his daughter, what was to become of her after he was gone? Was there no escape from the invisible network which was drawn all round him? He sank his head upon the table and sobbed at the thought of his own impotence. What was that? In the silence he heard a gentle scratching sound, low but very distinct in the quiet of the night. It came from the door of the house. Ferrier crept into the hall and listened intently. There was a pause for several moments, and then the low, insidious sound was repeated. Someone was evidently tapping very gently upon one of the panels of the door. Was it some midnight assassin who'd come to carry out the murderous orders of the secret tribunal? Or was it some agent who was marking up that the last day of grace had arrived? John Ferrier felt that instant death would be better than the suspense which shook his nerve and chilled his heart. Springing forward, he drew the bolt and threw the door open. Outside, all was calm and quiet. The night was fine, and the stars were twinkling brightly overhead. The little front garden lay before the farmer's eyes, bounded by the fence and gate, but neither there nor on the road were there any human being to be seen. With a sigh of relief, Ferrier looked to left and right, till happening to glance straight down at his own feet, he saw, to his astonishment, a man lying flat upon his face upon the ground, with arms and legs all asprawl. So nerved was he at the sight that he leaned up against the wall with his hand to his throat to stifle the inclination to call out. His first thought was that the prostrate figure was that of some wounded or dying man, but as he watched it, he saw it writhe along the ground and into the hall with the rapidity and noiselessness of a serpent. Once inside the house, the man sprung to his feet, closed the door, and revealed to the astonished farmer the fierce face and resolute expression of Jefferson Hope. "Good God," gasped John Ferrier. "How you scared me. Whatever made you come in like that?" "Give me food," the other said hoarsely. "I've had no time for bite or sup for 48 hours." He flung himself on the cold meat and bread which was still lying upon the table from his host's supper, and devoured it voraciously. "Does Lucy bear up well?" he asked when he had satisfied his hunger. "Yes, she does not know the danger," her father answered. "That is well. The house is watched from every side. That is why I crawled my way up to it. They may be darn sharp, but they're not quite sharp enough to catch a Washoe hunter." John Ferrier felt a different man now than he realized that he had a devoted ally. He seized the young man's leathery hand and wrung it cordially. "You're a man to be proud of," he said. "There are not many who would come to share our danger and our trouble." "You've hit it there, pard," the young hunter answered. "I have a respect for you, but if you were alone in my business, I'd think twice before putting my head into such a hornet's nest. It's Lucy that brings me here, and before harm comes to her, I guess there'd be one less of the Hope family in Utah. What are we to do? Tomorrow is your last day, and unless you act tonight, you are lost. I have a mule and 2 horses waiting in the Eagle Ravine. How much money have you?" $2,000 in gold and 5 in notes." "That will do. I have as much more to add to it. We must push for Carson City through the mountain. You had best wake Lucy. It is at all well that the servants do not sleep in the house." While Ferrier was absent, preparing his daughter for the approaching journey, Jefferson Hope packed all the eatables that he could find into a small parcel and filled a stoneware jar with water, for he knew by experience the mountain wells were few and far between. He had hardly completed his arrangements with his daughter before the farmer had returned with his daughter all dressed and ready for a start. The greeting between lovers was warm but brief, for moments were precious. There was much to be done. We must make our start at once," said Jefferson Hope, speaking in a low but resolute voice, like one who realizes the greatness of the peril, but has steeled his heart to meet it. "The front and back entrances are watched, but with caution we may get away to the side window and across the fields. Once on the road, we are only 2 miles from the ravine where the horses are waiting. By daybreak, we should be halfway through the mountain." "What if we're stopped?" asked Ferrier. Hope slapped a revolver butt which protruded from the front of his tunic. "There are too many for us. We shall take 2 or 3 of them with us," he said with a sinister. The lights inside the house had all but been extinguished, and from the darkened window Ferrier peered over the fields which had been his own, and which he was now about to abandon forever. He had long nerved himself to the sacrifice, however, and the thought of the honor and happiness of his daughter outweighed any regret for his ruined fortune. All looked so happy and peaceful, the rustled trees and broad, silent stretch of grainland, that it was difficult to realize that the spirit of murder lurked through it all. Yet the white face and set expression of the young hunter showed that in his approach to the house he had seen enough to satisfy him upon that head. Ferrier carried the bag of gold and notes. Jefferson Hope had the scanty provisions and water, while Lucy had a small bundle containing a few of her more valued possessions. Opening the window very slowly and carefully, they waited until a dark cloud had somewhat obscured the night, then one by one passed through into the garden. With bated breath and crouching figures, they stumbled across it and gained the shelter of the hedge, which they skirted until they came to the gap which opened into the cornfield. They had just reached this point when the young man seized his 2 companions and dragged them down into the shadow, where they lie silent and trembling. It was as well that his prairie training had given Jefferson Hope the ears of a lynx. He and his friends had hardly crouched down before the melancholy hooting of a mountain owl was heard within a few yards of them, which was immediately answered by another hoot at a small distance. At the same moment, a vague, shadowy figure emerged from the gap at which they had been making, and uttered the plaintive signal cry again, for which a second man appeared out of the obscurity. "Tomorrow at midnight," said the first, who appeared in the authority, "when the whip-poor Will calls 3. "It is well," returned the other. "Shall I tell Brother Drebber?" "Pass it on to him, and from him to the others. 9 to 7. 7 to 5, repeated the other, and the 2 figures flitted away in other directions. Their concluding words had evidently been some form of sign and countersign. The instant that their footsteps had died away into the distance, Jefferson Hope sprang to his feet, helping his companions through the gap, led the way across the fields at the top of his speed. supporting and half carrying the girl when her strength seemed to fail her. "Hurry on." Who is this? Jefferson Hope. Hurry on," he gasped from time to time. "We are through the line of sentinels. Everything depends on speed. Hurry on." Once on the high road, they made rapid progress. Only once did they meet anyone, and then they managed to slip into a field and so avoid recognition. Before reaching the town, the hunter branched away into a rugged and narrow footpath which led them into the mountain. Two dark, jagged peaks loomed above them through the darkness, and the defile which led between them was the Eagle Canyon, which the horses were awaiting them. With unerring instinct, Jefferson Hope picked his way among the great boulders and along the bed of the dried-up watercourse, until he came to the retired corner, screened with rocks, where the faithful animals had been picketed. The girl was placed upon the mule, an old farrier upon one of the horses with his money bag. Jefferson Hope led the other along the precipitous and dangerous path. It was a bewildering route for anyone who was not accustomed to face nature in her wildest mood. On the one side, a great crag towered 1,000 feet or more, black, stern, and menacing, with long basaltic columns upon its ragged surface, like the ribs of some petrified monster. On the other hand, a wild chaos of boulders and debris made all advance possible. Between the two ran the irregular track, so narrow in places that they had to travel in Indian file, and so rough that only practiced riders could have traversed it at all. Yet in spite of all dangers and difficulties, the heart of the fugitives were light within them, for every step increased the distance between them and the terrible despotism for which they were flying. Despotism? I don't know how to say it. They soon had a proof, however, that they were still within the jurisdiction of the saints. They had reached the very wildest and most desolate portion of the pass when the girl gave a startled cry, pointed upward. On a rock which overlooked the track, showing out dark and plain against the sky, there was a solitary sentinel. He saw them as soon as they perceived them, and his military challenge of, "Who goes there?" rang through the silent ravine. "Travelers for Nevada," said Jefferson Hope, with his hand upon the rifle which hung by his saddle. They could see the lonely watcher fingering his gun, peered down at him as if he were dissatisfied by the reply. "By whose permission?" he asked. "The Holy Four," answered Farrier. His Mormon experiences taught him that it was the highest authority to which he could refer. "9 from 7, cried the sentinel. 7 from 5, returned Jefferson Hope promptly, remembering the countersign which he'd heard in the garden. "Pass, and the Lord go with you," said the voice from above. Beyond his post, the path broadened out, and the horses were able to break into trot. Looking back, they could see the solitary watcher leaning upon his post, and they knew that they had passed the outlying posts of the chosen people, that freedom lay before them. Okay. Chapter 5. The Avenging Angels. All night their course lay through intricate defiles over irregular and rock-strewn paths. More than once they lost their way, but Hope's intimate knowledge of the mountains enabled them to regain the track once more. When morning broke, a scene of marvelous though savage beauty lay before them. In every direction, the great snow-capped peaks hemmed them in, peeping over each other's shoulders to the far horizon. So steep were the rocky banks of either side of them that the larch and the pine seemed to be suspended over their heads, and to need only a gust of wind to come hurtling down upon them. Nor was the fear entirely an illusion, for the barren valley was thickly strewn with trees and boulders which had fallen in a similar manner. Even as they passed, a great rock came thundering down with a hoarse rattle which woke the echoes in the silent gorges and startled the weary horses into a gallop. As the sun rose slowly above the eastern horizon, the caps of the great mountains lit up one after the other, like lamps at a festival, until they were all ruddy and glowing. The magnificent spectacle cheered the hearts of the three fugitives and gave them fresh energy. At a wild torrent which swept over the ravine, they called a halt and watered their horses, while they partook of a hasty breakfast. But Jefferson Hope was inexorable. They will be upon our track by this time," he said. "Everything depends upon our speed. Once safe in Carson, we may rest for the remainder of our lives." During the whole of that day, they struggled on through the defiles. By evening, they calculated that they were more than 30 miles from their enemy. At nighttime, they chose the base of a beetling crag where the rocks offered some protection from the chill wind. And there, huddled together for warmth, they enjoyed a few hours' sleep. Before daybreak, however, they were up and on their way once more. They'd seen no sign of their pursuers, and Jefferson Hope began to think that they were fairly out of the reach of the terrible organization whose enmity they'd incurred. He little knew how far that iron grasp could reach, or how soon it was to close upon them and crush them. About the middle of the second day of their flight, their scanty store of provisions had begun to run out. This gave the hunter little uneasiness, however, for there was game to be had among the mountain. He had frequently before had to depend on his rifle for the needs of life. Choosing a sheltered nook, he piled together a few dried branches and made a blazing fire, at which his companions might warm themselves. For they were now nearly 5,000 feet above the sea level, and the air was bitter and keen. Having tethered the horses and bade Lucy adieu, he threw his gun over his shoulder and set out in search of whatever chance might throw his way. Looking back, he saw the old man and young girl crouching over the blazing fire, while the three animals stood motionless in the background. Then the intervening rocks hid them from his view. He walked for a couple of miles through one ravine after another without success, though from the marks upon the bark of the trees and other indications, he judged that there were numerous bears in the vicinity. At last, after 2-3 hours' fruitless search, he was thinking of turning back in despair, when casting his eyes upward, he saw a sight which sent a thrill of pleasure through his heart. On the edge of a jutting pinnacle, 300 or 400 feet above him, there stood a creature somewhat resembling a sheep in appearance, but armed with a pair of gigantic horns. The bighorn, for so it is called, was acting, probably, as the guardian over a flock which were invisible to the hunter, but fortunately he was heading in the opposite direction, and had not perceived him. Lying on his face, he rested his rifle upon a rock and took a long and steady aim before drawing the trigger. The animal sprang into the air, tottered for a moment upon the edge of the precipice, and then came crashing down into the valley beneath. The creature was too unwieldy to lift, so the hunter contented himself with cutting away one haunch and part of the flank. With this trophy over his shoulder, he hastened to retrace his steps, for the evening was already drawing in. He'd hardly started, however, before he realized the difficulty which faced him. In his eagerness, he had wandered far past the ravines which were known to him, and it was no easy matter to pick the path which he had taken. The valley which he had found himself divided and subdivided into many gorges which were so like each other that he found it impossible to distinguish one from the other. He followed one for a mile or more till he came to a mountain torrent which he'd never seen before. Convinced that he'd taken the wrong turn, he tried another, but with the same results. Night was coming on rapidly, and it was almost dark before he finally found himself in a defile that was familiar to him. Even though it was no easy matter to keep to the right track, for the moon had not yet risen, and the high cliffs on either side made the obscurity more profound. Weighed down by his burden and weary from his exertions, he stumbled along, keeping up his heart by the reflection that every step brought him closer to Lucy, that he carried with him enough to ensure them food for the remainder of their journey. He had now come to the mouth of the very defile in which he had left them. Even in the darkness, he could recognize the outline of the cliffs that bounded it. They must, he reflected, be waiting him anxiously, for he had been absent nearly 5 hours. In the gladness of his heart, he put his hands to his mouth and made the glen re-echo to a loud halloo as a signal that he was coming. He paused and listened for an answer. None came save his own cry, which clattered up the dreary, silent ravines, and was borne back to his ears in countless repetition. Again he shouted, even louder than before, and again no whisper came back from his friends which he had left such a short time ago. A vague, nameless dread came over him, and he hurried onwards frantically, dropping the precious food in his agitation. When he turned the corner, he came full in sight of the spot where the fire had been lit. There was still a glowing pile of wood ashes there, but it had evidently not been tended since his departure. The same dead silence still reigned all around. With his fears all changed to convictions, he hurried on. There was no living creature near the remains of the fire. Animals, man, maiden, all were gone. It was only too clear that some sudden and terrible disaster had occurred during his absence, a disaster that embraced them all, and yet had left no traces behind it. Bewildered and stunned by this blow, Jefferson Hope felt his hand spin round and had to lean upon his rifle to save himself from falling. Sherlock Holmes is just chilling. He was essentially a man of action, however, and speedily recovering from his temporary impotence. Seizing a half-consumed piece of wood from the smoldering fire, he blew it into a flame and proceeded with his help to examine the little camp. The ground was all stamped down by the feet of horses, showed that a huge party of mounted men had overtaken them, the fugitives. The direction of their tracks proved that they had afterwards turned back to Salt Lake City. Had they carried back both of his companions with them? Jefferson Hope had almost persuaded himself that they must have done so when his eyes fell upon an object which made every nerve of his body tingle within him. Well, I mean, it's a classic, Brainbuster. I'm glad you're enjoying it. I am too. A little way on the side of the camp was a low-lying heap of reddish soil, which had assuredly not been there before. We laugh every time. Been there before. There was no mistaking it for a newly dug grave. As the young hunter approached it, he perceived that a stick had been planted on it, with a sheet of paper stuck in the cleft fork of it. The inscription upon the paper was brief, but to the point. John Ferrier, formerly of Salt Lake City, died August 4th, 1860. The sturdy old man, whom he had left so shortly a time before, was gone then, and this was all his epitaph. Jefferson Hope looked wildly round to see if there was a second grave, but there was no sign of one. Lucy had been carried back by their terrible pursuers to fulfill their original destiny by becoming one of the harem of the elder's son. As the young fellow realized the certainty of her fate and his own powerlessness to prevent it, he wished that he too was lying with his old farmer in the last silent resting. Again, however, his active spirit shook off the lethargy which springs from despair. If there is nothing left to him, he could at least devote his life to revenge. With indomitable patience and perseverance, Jefferson Hope possessed also a power of sustained vindictiveness, which he may have learned from the Indians among which he had lived. As he stood by the desolate fire, he felt that the only one thing which he could assuage his guilt would be thorough and complete retribution brought by his own hand upon his enemies. His strong will and tiring energy should, he determined, be devoted to that one end. With a grim and white face, he retraced his steps to where he dropped his food, and having stirred up the smoldering fire, he cooked enough to last him a few days. Then he made it into a bundle, and, tired as he was, he set himself to walk back through the mountains on the track of the avenging angel. For 5 days he toiled footsore and weary through the defiles which he had already traversed on horseback. At night he flung himself down among the rocks, snatched a few hours' sleep, but before daybreak he was always well on his way. On the 6th day he reached the Eagle Canyon, for which he had commenced their ill-fated flight. Thence he could look down upon the home of the saints. Worn and exhausted, he leaned upon his rifle and shook his gaunt hand fiercely at the silent, widespread city beneath them. As he looked at it, he observed that there were flags in some of the principal streets, and other signs of festivity. He was still speculating as to what this might mean when he heard the clatter of horses' hooves, and he saw a mounted man riding towards him. As he approached, he recognized him as a Mormon named Cowper, to whom he had rendered services at different times. He therefore accosted him when he got up to him with the object of finding out what Lucy Ferrier's fate had been. "I am Jefferson Hope," he said. "You remember me." The Mormon looked at him with undisguised astonishment. Indeed, it was difficult to recognize in this tattered, unkempt wanderer with ghastly white face and fierce, wild eyes the spruce young hunter of his former days. Having, however, at last satisfied himself to his identity, the man's surprise changed to consternation. "You are mad to come here," he cried. "It is as much as my own life is worth to be seen talking with you. There is a warrant against you from the Holy Four for assisting the Ferrier's way." "I don't fear them, or their warrants," Hope said earnestly. "You must know something of this matter, Cowper. I conjure you, by everything you hold dear, to answer a few questions. We've always been friends. For God's sakes, don't refuse to answer me." "Well, what is it?" the Mormon asked uneasily. Be quick. The very rock's heavier than the tree's eyes." what has become of Lucy Ferrier. She was married yesterday to young Drebber. Oh, hold up, man. You have no life left in you. Don't mind me, said Hope faintly. He was white to the very lips and had sunk down on the stone upon which he'd been leaning. Married, you say? Married yesterday. That's what those flags are for on the endowment house. There were some words between young Drebber and young Strangerson as to which was to have her. They'd both been in party that followed them, and Strangerson had shot her father, which seemed to give him the best claim. But when they argued it out of council, Drebber's party was the stronger, so the prophet gave her over to him. No one won't have her very long, though, for I saw death in her face yesterday. She is more like a ghost than a woman. Are you off, then? Yes, I am off, said Jefferson Hope, who had risen from his seat. His face might have been chiseled from marble, so hard and set was his expression, while his eyes glowed with a baleful light. Where are you going? Never mind, he answered, and flinging his weapon over his shoulder, strode down over the gorge and so away into the heart of the mountain to the haunts of the wild beasts. Amongst them all there was none so fierce and dangerous as himself. The prediction of the Mormon was only too well fulfilled. Whether it was the terrible death of her father or the effects of the hateful marriage into which she had been forced, poor Lucy never held up her head again, but pined away and died within a month? What? Her sottish husband, who had married her principally for the sake of John Ferrier's property, did not affect any great grief at his bereavement, but his other wives mourned over her, and sat up with her the night before the burial, as is the Mormon custom. They were grouped round her bier in the early hours of the morning, when, to their inexpressible fear and astonishment, the door was flung open, and a savage-looking, weather-beaten man in tattered garments strode into the room. Without a glance or a word to the cowering woman, he strode up to the white, silent figure which had once contained the pure soul of Lucy Ferrier. Stooped over her, he pressed his lips reverently to her cold forehead. Then, snatching up her hand, he took the wedding ring from her finger. You will not be married in that, he cried with a fierce snarl, and before an alarm could be raised, sprang down the stairs and was gone. So strange and brief was the episode that the watchers might have found it hard to believe it themselves or persuade other people of it, had it not been for the undeniable fact that the circlet of gold which marked her as having been a bride had disappeared. I'm starting to get an inkling of this story. For some months, Jefferson Hope lingered among the mountains, leading a strange wild life and nursing his heart the fierce desire for vengeance which possessed him. Tales were told in the city of weird figure which was seen prowling along the suburbs, and which haunted the lonely mountain gorges. Once a bullet whistled through Stangerson's window and flattened itself upon the wall within a foot of him. On another occasion, as Drebber passed under a cliff, a great boulder crashed down on him. He only escaped a terrible death by throwing himself upon his face. The two young Mormons were not long in discovering the reason of these attempts upon their lives, and led repeated expeditions into the mountain, the hope of capturing or killing their enemy, but always without success. They then adopted the precaution of never going out alone or after nightfall, and of having their houses guarded. After a time, they were able to relax these measures, for nothing was either heard or seen of their opponent, and they hoped that the time had cooled his vindictiveness. Far from doing so, it had, if anything, augmented it. The hunter's mind was of a hard, unyielding nature. The predominant idea of revenge had taken such complete possession of it that there was no room for any other emotion. He was, however, above all things, practical. He soon realized that even his iron constitution could not stand the incessant strain upon which he was putting upon it. Exposure and want of wholesome food was wearing him out. If he died like a dog among the mountain, where was he to become of his revenge then? What was to become of his revenge then? And yet such a death was sure to overtake him if he persisted. He felt that that was to play his enemy's game, so reluctantly he returned to the old Nevada mines, there to recruit his health and to amass money enough to allow him to pursue his object without privation. His intention had been to be absent a year at the most, but a combination of unforeseen circumstances prevented his leaving the mines for nearly 5. At the end of that time, however, his memory of his wrongs and his craving for revenge were quite as keen as on that memorable night when he stood by John Ferrier's grave. Disguised and under an assumed name, he returned to Salt Lake City, careless what became of his own life, as long as he obtained what he knew to be justice. There, he found evil tidings awaiting him. There had been a schism among the chosen people a few months before, some of the younger members of the church having rebelled against the authority of the elders. And the result had been the secession of a certain number of the malcontents, who had left Utah and became Gentiles. Among these had been Drebber and Strangerson, and no one knew whither they had gone. Rumor reported that Drebber had managed to convert a large part of his property into money, that he'd departed a wealthy man, while his companion, Strangerson, was comparatively poor. There was no clue at all, however, as to their whereabouts. Many a man, however vindictive, would have abandoned all thought of revenge in the face of such difficulty, but Jefferson Hope never faltered for a moment. With the small competence he possessed, eked out by such employment as he could pick up, he traveled from town to town through the United States in the quest of his enemy. Year passed into year, his black hair turned grizzled, but still he wandered on, a human bloodhound, with his mind wholly set upon the one object upon which he had devoted his life. At last his perseverance was rewarded. It was but a glance of a face in a window, but that one glance told them that Cleveland of Ohio possessed the man whom he was in pursuit of. He returned to his miserable lodgings, with a plan of vengeance all arranged. It chanced, however, that Drebber, looking from his window, had recognized the vagrant in the street, and had read murder in his eyes. He hurried before a justice of the peace, accompanied by Strangerson, who had become his private secretary, and represented to him that they were in danger of their lives from the jealousy and hatred of an old rival. That evening Jefferson Hope was taken into custody, and not being able to find sureties, was detained for some weeks. When at last he was liberated, it was only to find that Drebber's house was deserted, and that he and his secretary had departed for Europe. Again the avenger had been foiled, and again the concentrated hatred urged him to continue his pursuit. Funds were wanting, however, and for some time he had to return to work, saving every dollar for his approaching journey. At last, having collected enough to keep life in him, he departed for Europe, and tracked his enemies from city to city, working his way in any menial capacity, never overtaking his fugitive. When he reached St. Petersburg, they had departed for Paris, and when he followed them there, he had learned that they had just set off for Copenhagen. At the Danish capital, he was again a few days late, for they had been journeying on to London, where he had at last succeeded in running them to earth. As to what had occurred there, we cannot do any better than to quote the old hunter's own account, as duly recorded in Dr. Watson's journal, to which we are already under such obligation. Chapter 6. A continuation. Good time for it. Continuation of the reminiscences of John Watson, MD. Our prisoner's furious resistance did not apparently indicate any ferocity for his disposition towards ourselves, for on finding himself powerless, he smiled in an ineffable manner and expressed his hopes he had not hurt any of us in the scuffle. "I guess you're going to take me to the police station," he remarked. "My cab's at the door. If you'll loose my legs, I'll walk down to it. I'm not so light to lift as I used to." Gregson and Lestrade exchanged glances. They thought this proposition rather a bold one. Holmes at once took the prisoner at his word, loosened the towel in which was bound around his ankle. He rose and stretched his legs, though to assure himself that he was free once more. I remember that I thought to myself, as I eyed him, that I had seldom seen a more powerfully built man, and his dark sunburned face bore an expression of determination and energy, formidable as his personal strength. "If there's a vacant place for a chief of police, I reckon you are the man for it," he said, gazing with undisguised admiration at my fellow lodger. The way you kept on my trail was a caution. You'd better come with me, said Holmes to the two detectives. I can drive you, said Lestrade. Good, and Gregson can come inside with me. You too, Doctor. You've taken an interest in this case and may well stick to us. I assented gladly, and we all descended together. Our prisoner made no attempt at escape, but stepped calmly into the cab which had been his. We followed him. Lestrade mounted the box, whipped up the horse, and brought us in a very short time to our destination. We were ushered into a small chamber where the police inspector noted down our prisoner's name and the names of the men with whose murder he'd been charged. Excuse me. The official was a white-faced, emotional man who went through his duties in a dull, mechanical way. The prisoner will be put before the magistrates in the of a week, he said. Meantime, Jefferson Hope, have you anything that you wish to say? I must warn you, the words will be taken down and may be used against you. I've got a good deal to say, our prisoner said slowly. I want to tell you gentlemen all about it. Hadn't you better reserve that for your trial? Asked the inspector. I may never be tried, he answered. You needn't look startled. It isn't suicide I'm thinking of. Are you a doctor? He turned his fierce dark eyes upon me as he asked the last question. Yes, I am. Then put your hand here, he said with a smile, motioning to his manacled wrist towards his chest. I did so, and became at once conscious, extraordinary throbbing and commotion going inside. The walls of his chest seemed to thrill and quiver as a frail building would do inside when some powerful engine would work. In the silence of the room, I could hear a dull humming and buzzing noise which proceeded from the same source. Why, I cried, you have an aortic aneurysm. That's what they called it, he said placidly. I went to a doctor last week about it, and he told me that it was bound to burst before many days had passed. It's been getting worse for years. I got it from overexposure and underfeeding among the Salt Lake Mountains. I've done my work now, and I care how soon I go. I'd like to leave some account of the business behind me. I don't want to be remembered as some common cutthroat. The inspector and the two detectives had a hurried discussion as to advisability, allowing him to tell the story. Do you consider, Doctor, that there's immediate danger? Most certainly there is, I answered. In this case, it is clearly our duty in the interests of justice to take his stand, said the inspector. You are at liberty, sir, to give your account. Again, warn you to be taken down. I'll sit down, with your leave, the prisoner said, suiting the word to action to the word. This aneurysm of mine makes me tired. The tussle we had half an hour ago has not mended things. I'm on the brink of the grave, and I'm not likely to lie to you. Every word I say is the absolute truth, and how you use it is a matter of no consequence. With these words, Jefferson Hope leaned back in his chair and began the following remarkable statement. He spoke in his calm and methodical manner, as though the events for which he narrated were commonplace enough. I can vouch for the accuracy of the subjoined account, which I have had access to Lestrade's notebook, in which the prisoner's words were taken down exactly as they were. It don't much matter to you as why I hated these men. It's enough that they were guilty of the death of two human beings, father and a daughter, and for that they had therefore forfeited their own lives. After the lapse of time that has passed since their crime, it's impossible to secure a conviction against them in any court. I knew of their guilt, though, and I determined that I should be the judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one. You'd have done the same. If you've any manhood in you, you'd have done the same. That girl that I spoke to you was to have married me 20 years ago. She was forced into marrying that same Drebber and broke her heart over it. I took the marriage ring from her dead finger, and I vowed his dying eyes should rest upon that very ring, and that his very thoughts should be of the crime for which he was punished. I have carried it about with me, and I followed him and his accomplice over 2 continents until I found them. They thought to tire me out, but they could not do it. If I die tomorrow, as is likely enough, I die knowing that my work in this world is complete and well done. They have perished, and by my hand, there is nothing left for me or hope for me to dire. They were rich, and I was poor, so that it was no easy matter for me to follow them. When I got to London, my pocket was about empty, and I found that I must turn my hand to something for my living. Driving and riding were as natural to me as walking, so I applied at a cab owner's office and soon got employment. I was to bring a certain sum a week to the owner, and whatever was over that I might keep for myself. There was seldom much over, but I managed to scrape along somehow. The hardest part was to learn my way around, for I reckon that all the mazes that ever were contrived, this city is the most confusing. I had a map beside me, though, and when once I had spotted the principal hotels and stations, I got on pretty well. It was some time before I found out where my 2 gentlemen were living, but I inquired and inquired until at last I dropped across them. They were at a boarding house at Camberwell, over on the other side of the river. When once I found them, I knew that I had them at mercy. I had grown my beard, and there was no chance of them recognizing me. I would dog them and follow them until I saw my opportunity. I was determined that they would not escape me again. They were very near doing it, for all that. Go where they would about London, I was always at their heels. Sometimes I followed them on the cab and sometimes on foot, but the former was always the best, for then they could not get away. It was only early in the morning or late at night that I could earn anything, so that I began to get behind my hand with my employer. I did not mind that, however, as long as I could lay my hand on the men I wanted. They were very cunning, though. They must have thought that there was some chance of their being followed, for they would never go out alone, and never after nightfall. During 2 weeks I drove behind them every day, and I never once saw them separate. Drebber himself was drunk half the time, but Strangerson was not to be caught napping. I watched them late and early, but never saw the ghost of a chance. But I was not discouraged, for something told me that the hour had almost come. My only fear was this thing in my chest might burst a little too soon and leave my work undone. At last, one evening I was driving up and down Torquay Terrace when the street was called in which they boarded. When I saw a cab drive up to their door, presently some luggage was brought out, and after a while Drebber and Strangerson followed it and drove off. I whipped up my horse and kept within sight of them, feeling very ill at ease, for I feared that they were going to shift their quarters. At Euston Station they got out, and I left a boy to hold my horse and followed them on the platform. I heard them ask for the Liverpool train, and the guard answer that one had just gone and there would not be another for some hours. Strangerson seemed to be put off at that, but Drebber was rather pleased than otherwise. I got so close to them in the bustle, I could hear every word that passed between them. Drebber said that he had a little business to do of his own, and that if the other would wait for him, that he would soon rejoin him. His companion remonstrated with him and reminded him that they had resolved to stick together. Drebber answered that the matter was a delicate one and that he must go alone. I could not catch what Strangerson said to that, but the other one burst out swearing and reminded him that he was nothing more than his paid servant, that he must not presume to dictate to him. On that, the secretary gave it up as a bad job and simply bargained with him that if he missed the last train, he should rejoin him at Halliday's private hotel, to which Drebber answered that he would be back on the platform before 11, and made his way out the station. The moment for which I'd waited so long had at last come. I had my enemies within my power. Together they could protect each other, but singly they were at my mercy. I did not act, however, with undue precipitation. My plans were already formed. There was no satisfaction in vengeance unless the offender has time to realize who it is that strikes him and why retribution is upon him. I had my plans arranged by which I should have the opportunity of making the man who had wronged me understand that his old sin had found him out. It chanced that some day before, a gentleman who had been engaged in looking over some houses in the Brixton Road had dropped the key of one of them in my carriage. It was claimed that same evening and returned, but in the interval I had taken a molding of it and had a duplicate constructed. By means of this, I had access to at least one spot in this great city where I could rely upon being free from interruption.
I'm as hard as Nigali steel.
As hard as Nigali steel.
Nice ball. How to get Drebber to that house was the difficult problem which I now had to solve. He walked down the road and went into one of 2 liquor shops, staying for nearly half an hour in the last of them. When he came out, he staggered in his walk and was evidently pretty well on. There was a hansom just in front of me, and he hailed it. I followed so close that the nose of my horse was within a yard of his driver the whole way. We rattled across Waterloo Bridge and through miles of streets, and to my astonishment, we found ourselves back in the terrace from which he'd boarded. I could not imagine what his intention was in returning there, but I went on and pulled my cab a few hundred yards or so from the house. He entered it, and his hansom drove away. Give me a drink of water, if you please. My mouth gets dry with all the talking. I handed him a glass and drank it down. That's better, he said. Well, I waited for a quarter of an hour or more. When suddenly there came a noise like people struggling inside the house. Next minute, honk. Next minute, the door was flung open, and 2 men appeared, one of which was Drebber, and the other was a young chap whom I'd never seen before. This fellow had Drebber by the collar, and when they came up to the head of the steps, he gave him a shove and a kick which sent him half across the road. "You hound!" he cried, shaking his stick at him. "I'll teach you to insult an honest girl." He was so hot that I think he could have thrashed Drebber with his cudgel, only that the cur staggered away down the road as fast as his legs would carry him. He ran as far as the corner, and then, seeing my cab, he hailed me and jumped in. "Take me to the Holidays Private Hotel," said he. When I had him fairly inside my cab, my heart jumped with so much joy that I feared lest at this last moment my aneurysm might go wrong. I drove along slowly, weighing in my own mind what it was best to do. I might take him right into the country, and there in some deserted lane have my last interview with him. I'd almost decided upon this when he solved the problem for me. The craze for drink had seized him again, and he ordered me to pull up outside a gin palace. He went inside, leaving word that I should wait for him. There he remained until closing time, and when he came out, he was so far gone that I knew the game was in my own hand. Don't imagine that I intended to kill him in cold blood. It would have only been rigid justice if I'd done so, but I could not bring myself to do it. I had long determined that he should have a show for his life if he chose to take advantage of it. Among the many billets which I have filled in America during my wandering life, I was once janitor and sweeper of the laboratory at York College. One day the professor was lecturing on poisons, and he showed his students some alkaloid, as he called it, which he has extracted from the South American arrow poison, and which was so powerful that the least graint meant instant death. I spotted the bottle in which this preparation was kept. When they were all gone, I helped myself to a little of it. It was a fairly good dispenser, so I worked this alkaloid into small, soluble pills, and each pill I put in a box with a similar pill made without the poison. I determined at the time that when I had my chance, my gentlemen should each have a draw of one of these boxes, while I ate the pill that remained. It would be quite as deadly, and a good deal less noisy than firing across a handkerchief. From that day, I always had my pill boxes about with me, and the time had come when I was to use them. It was nearer 1 to 12 and a wild, bleak night, blowing hard and raining in torrents. Dismal as it was outside, I was glad within, so glad that I could have shouted from pure exultation. If any of you gentlemen have ever pined for a thing and longed for it 20 long years, and suddenly found it within your reach, you'll understand my feelings. I lit a cigar and puffed it to steady my nerves, but my hands were trembling and my temples throbbing with excitement. As I drove, I could see old John Ferrier and sweet Lucy looking out at me as the darkness, smiling at me, just as plain as I see you all in this room. All the way they were ahead of me, one to each side of the horse, until I pulled up at the side of Brixton Road. There was not a soul to be seen, nor a sound to be heard, except the dripping and the rain. When I looked in the window, I saw Drebber all huddled together in a drunken sleep. I shook him by the arm. "Time to get out," I said. "All right, cabby," said he. I suppose he thought that we'd come to the hotel that he'd mentioned, for he got out without another word and followed me down the garden. I had to walk beside him to keep him steady, for he was still a little top-heavy. When he came to the door, I opened it and led him into the front room. I give you my word that all the way the father and daughter were walking in front of us. "It's entirely dark," said he, stamping about. "We'll soon have a light," I said, striking a match and putting it to a wax candle that I'd brought with me. "Now, Enoch Drebber," I continued. "Enoch Drebber," I continued, turning to him and holding the light to my own face. "Oh my." He gazed at me with bleared, drunken eyes for a moment. Then I saw horror spring up in him, convulse his whole feature, which showed me that he knew me. He staggered back with a livid face, and I saw perspiration break out upon his brow while his teeth chattered in his head. At his sight, I leaned my back against the door and laughed loud and long. I had always known that vengeance would be sweet, but I had never hoped for the contentment of soul that now possessed me. "You dog," I said, "I've hunted you from Salt Lake City to St. Petersburg, and you've always escaped me. Now, at last, your wanderings have come to an end, for neither you nor I shall see in tomorrow's sunrise." He shrank still further away as I spoke, and I could see on his face that he thought I was mad, though I was for the time. The pulses in my head beat like sledgehammers. I believe I would have had a fit of some sort if blood had not gushed from my nose and relieved me. "What do you think of Lucy Ferrier now?" I cried, locking the door and shaking the key in his face. "Punishment has been slow in coming, but it has overtaken you at last." I saw his coward lips tremble as I spoke. He would have begged for his life, but he knew well that it was useless. "Would you murder me?" he stammered. "There is no murder," I answered. "Who talks of murdering a mad dog? What mercy had you upon my poor darling when you dragged her from her slaughtered father and bore her away to your accursed and shameless harem?" "It was not I who killed her father," he cried. "But it was you who broke her innocent heart," I shrieked, thrusting the box before him. "Let the high God judge between us. Choose and eat. There is death in one and life in the other. I will choose what you... Let us see if there is justice upon the earth, or if we are ruled by chance." He cowered away from me with wild cries and prayers for mercy, but I drew my knife and held it to his throat until he obeyed me. Then I swallowed the other, and we stood facing one another in silence for a moment or two, waiting to see which was to live, which was to die. Shall I ever forget the look which came over his face when the first warning pangs told me that the poison would them? I laughed as I saw it, and held Lucy's marriage ring in front of his eyes. It was but for a moment, for the action of the alkaloid is rapid. The spasm of pain contorted his features. He threw his hands out in front of him, staggered, and then, with a hoarse cry, fell heavily on the ground. I turned him over with my foot, placed my hand upon his heart. There was no movement, he was dead. The blood had been streaming from my nose, but I'd taken no notice of it. I don't know what it was that had put in my head.
Oh, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon,
Good evening and good night. I don't know what it was that they'd put in my head to write upon the wall with it. Perhaps it was some mischievous idea of setting the police upon a wrong track. Or for I felt light-hearted and cheerful. I remember a German being found in New York with Rach written above him, and it was argued at the time that the newspaper that the secret societies must have done it. I guess that was what had puzzled the New Yorkers, what had puzzled the Londoners. So I dipped my finger in my own blood and printed it on a convenient place on the wall. Then I walked down to my cab and found that there was no one about, that the night was still very wild. I had driven some distance when I put my hand into my pocket where I usually kept Lucy's ring, found that it was not there. I was thunderstruck by this, for it was the only memento that I had of her. Thinking that I might have dropped it when I stooped over Drebber's body, I drove back, and leaving my cab in a side street, I went boldly up to the house, for I was ready to dare anything rather than lose the ring. When I arrived there, I walked right into the arms of a police officer who was coming out, and only managed to disarm his suspicions by pretending to be a hopeless drunk. That was how Enoch Drebber came to his end. All I had to do then was do as much for Strangerson and so pay off John Ferrier's debt. I knew that he was staying at Holiday's private hotel, and I hung about all day, but he never came out. I fancy he suspected something when Drebber failed to put in an appearance. He was cunning with Strangerson, always guard. If he thought he could keep me off by staying indoors, he was very much mistaken. Very much. There we go. I soon found out which was the window of his bedroom. Early next morning, I took advantage of some ladders which were lying in the lane behind the hotel, and so made my way into his room in the gray of dawn. I woke him up and told him that the hour had come when I was to answer for the life that I'd taken so long before, basically a Cliff Notes of the other guy. I described Drebber's death to him, and I gave him the same choice of the poison pill. Instead of grasping at the chance for safety which was offered to him, he sprang from his bed and flew at my throat. In self-defense, I stabbed him at the heart. It would never have been the same in any case, for Providence would never have allowed his guilty hand to pick out anything but. I have little more to say, and it's as well, for I am about done. I went on cabbing it for a day or so, intending to keep at it until I could save as much to take me back to America. I was standing in the yard when a ragged youngster asked if there was a cabbie there called Jefferson Hope, and said that his cab was wanted by a gentleman in 221 Baker Street. I went round, suspecting no harm. The next thing I knew, this young man here had the bracelets on my wrist, and as neatly shackled as ever I saw in my life. That's the whole of my story, gentlemen. You may consider me to be a murderer, but I hold that I am just as much an officer of the justice as you are. So thrilling had the man's narrative been, manner so impressive that we sat silent and absorbed. Even the professional detective, blasé as they were in every detail of the crime, appeared to be keenly interested in the man's story. When he finished, we sat for some moments by a stillness which was only broken by the scratching of Lestrade's pencil as he gave the finishing touches, shorthand account. "There is only one point for which I'd like a little more information," Sherlock Holmes said at last. "Who was your accomplice for whom came the ring for which I advertised?" The prisoner winked at my friend jocosely. "I can tell my own secret," he said, "but I don't get other people in trouble. I saw your advertisement, and I thought it might be a plant, or it might be the ring which I wanted. My friend volunteered to go see. I think you'll own he did it." "Not a doubt of that," said Holmes heartily. "Now, gentlemen," the inspector remarked gravely, "the forms of law must be complied with. On Thursday, the prisoner will be brought before the magistrates, and attendance will be required. Until then, I will be responsible for him." He rang the bell as he spoke. Jefferson Hope was led off by a couple of warders, while my friend and I made our way out the station, took a cab back to Baker Street. You'd know more about that than I would, Brainbuster. I know Moriarty only by name. Pretty much it. Chapter 7. The Conclusion. We had all been warned to appear before the magistrates upon the Thursday, but when the Thursday came, there was no occasion for our testimony. A higher judge had taken the matter in hand, and Jefferson Hope had been summoned before a tribunal where strict justice would be meted out to him. On the very night after his capture, the aneurysm burst. He was found in the morning stretched upon the floor of his cell, with a placid smile on his face, as though he'd been able in his dying moments to look upon a useful life, his work well done. Gregson and Lestrade will be wild upon his death, Holmes remarked as we chatted upon it the next evening. Where will their grand advertisement be now? I don't see they had very much to do with his capture, I answered. What you do in this world is a matter of no consequence, returned my companion bitterly. The question is what you make people believe it is you've done. Never mind, continued more brightly after a pause. I would not have missed the investigation for anything. There's been no better case within my recollection. Simple as it was, there were several most instructive points about it. Simple, I ejaculated. Well, really, it can hardly be described as otherwise, said Sherlock Holmes, smiling at my surprise. The proof of its intrinsic simplicity is that without any help, save a few very ordinary deductions, I was able to lay my hand upon the criminal within 3 days. That is true, said I. I'd already explained to you that what is out of the common is usually a guide rather than a hindrance. In solving a problem of this sort, the grand thing is to be able to reason backwards. That is a very useful accomplishment, a very easy one, but people do not practice it much. In the everyday affairs of life, it is more useful to reason forward, and so the other comes to be neglected. There is 50 who can reason synthetically for 1 who can reason analytically. I confess, said I, that I do not quite follow you. I hardly expected that you would. Let me see if I can make it clearer. Most people, if you describe a train of events to them, will tell you what the result would be. They can put the events together in their minds, argue from them that something will come to pass. There are a few people, however, if you told them a result, would be able to evolve from their own inner consciousness the steps that were which to lead up to the result. This power is what I mean when I talk of reasoning backwards or analytically. I understand. Now, this was a case in which you were given the result, had to endeavor everything else for yourself. Now let me endeavor to show you the different steps in my reason. Begin at the beginning. I approached the house, as you know, on foot, and with my mind entirely free of all impressions. I naturally began examining the roadway. There, as I have already explained to you, I saw clearly the marks of a cab, which I ascertained by inquiry must have been there during the night. I satisfied myself that it was a cab and not a private carriage by the narrow gauge of the wheel. The ordinary London growler is considerably less wide than a gentleman's gown. This was the first point gained. I then walked slowly down the garden path, which happened to be composed of a clay soil particularly suitable for taking impression. No doubt it appeared to you to be mere trampled line of slush, but to my trained eyes, every mark upon its surface has a meaning. There is no branch of detective science which is so important and so much neglected as the art of tracing footsteps. Happily, I've always laid great stress upon it. Much practice has made it second nature. I saw the heavy footsteps of the constables, but I saw also the track of the 2 men who had first passed through the garden. It was easy to tell that they'd been before the others because in places their marks had been entirely obliterated by the others coming upon the top of them. In this way, my second link was formed, which told me that the nocturnal visitors were 2 in number. 1 remarkable from his height, I calculated from the length of his stride, and 2, and the other fashionably dressed, judged from the small and elegant impression left by his boots. On entering the house, this last inference was confirmed. My well-booted man lay before. The tall one, then, had done the murder. Murder there was. There was no wound upon the dead man's head, but the agitated expression upon his face assured me that he'd foreseen his fate before it came upon him. Men who die from heart disease or any sudden natural death never by any chance exhibit agitation on their face. Having sniffed the dead man's lips, I detected a slightly sour smell, and I came to the conclusion that he had had poison forced upon him. Again, I argued that it had been forced upon him from the hatred and fear expressed upon his face. By the method of exclusion, I had arrived at this result, for no other hypothesis would meet the facts. Do not imagine that this was very unheard of idea. The forcible admission of poison is by no means a new thing in criminal annals. The cases of Dolsky and Odessa and of Leturier and Atelier will occur at once to any toxicologist. And now came the great question as to the reason why. Robbery had not been the object of the murder, for nothing was taken. Was it politics then, or was it a woman? That is the question that confronted me. I was inclined from the first to do the latter supposition. Political assassins are only too glad to do their work and to fly. This murder had, on the contrary, been done most deliberately, and the perpetrator had left his tracks all over the room, showing that he'd been there all the time. It must have been a private wrong, not a political one, which called for such methodical revenge. When the inscription was discovered upon the wall, I was more inclined than ever to my opinion. The thing was too evidently a blind. When the ring was found, however, it settled the question. Clearly, the murderer had used it to remind the victim of some dead or absent woman. It was at this point I asked Gregson whether he had inquired in his telegram to Cleveland as to any particular point in Mr. Drebber's former career. He answered, you remember, in the negative. I then proceeded to make a careful examination of the room, which confirmed to me in my opinion as to the murderer's height and furnished me with the additional details as to the trichinopoly cigar and the length of his nails. I had already come to the conclusion, since there was no signs of a struggle, that the blood which covered the floor had burst from the murderer's nose in his excitement. I could perceive that the track of blood coincided with the track of his feet. It is seldom that any man, unless he is full-blooded, breaks out in this way through emotion, so I hazarded the opinion that the criminal was probably a robust and ruddy-faced man. Events proved that I had judged correctly. Having left the house, I proceeded to what Gregson had neglected. I telephoned to the head of the police in Cleveland, limiting my inquiry to the circumstances connected with the marriage of Enoch Drebber. The answer was conclusive. It told me that Drebber had already applied for the protection of the law against an old rival in love named Jefferson Hope, and that the same Hope was present in England. I knew now that I had held the clue to the mystery in my hand, and that all was remained was to secure the murderer. I had already determined in my own mind that the man who had walked into the house was Drebber. With Drebber was none other than the man who had driven the cab. The marks in the road showed me that the horse had wandered in on a way that could have been impossible were there anyone else in charge of it. Where then could the driver be, unless he were inside the house? Again, it was absurd to suppose that any sane man would carry out a deliberate crime under the very eyes, as it were, of a third person, who was sure to betray him. Lastly, supposing one man wished to dog another through London, what better means could he adopt than to turn cab driver? All these considerations led me to the irresistible conclusion that Jefferson Hope was to be found among the Jarveys of the metropolis. If he had been one, there was no reason to believe that he had ceased to be. On the contrary, from his point of view, any sudden change would be likely to draw attention to himself. He would probably, for a time at least, continue to perform his duty. There was no reason to suppose that he was going under an assumed name. Why would he change his name in a country where no one knew his original one? I therefore organized my street Arab detectives, and sent them systematically to every cab proprietor in London until they ferreted out the man that I wanted. How well they succeeded, how quickly I took advantage of it, are still fresh in your recollection. The murder of Strangerson was an incident that was entirely unexpected, but which could hardly in any case have been prevented. Though it, as you know, I came into possession of the pills, the existence of which I'd already surmised. You see the whole thing as a chain of logical sequences without a break or a flaw. It is wonderful, I cried. Your merit should be publicly recognized. You should publish an account of your case. If you won't, I will for you. You may do what you like, Doctor, he answered. See here, he continued, handing a paper over to me. Look at this. It was the echo for the day. The paragraph to which he pointed was devoted to the case in question. The public, it said, have lost a sensational treat to the sudden death of the man Hope, who was suspected of the murder of Mr. Enoch Trevor and of Mr. Joseph Strangerson. The details of the case will probably never be known now, though we are informed upon good authority that the crime was a result of an old-standing and romantic feud, in which love and Mormonism bore a part. It seems that both the victims belonged in their younger days to the Latter-day Saints. Hope, the deceased prisoner, hails also from Salt Lake City. If the case has had no other effect, it has, at least, brought out the most striking manner of the efficiency of our detective police force, and they will likely serve as a lesson to all foreigners, if they do, that they will do wisely to settle their feuds at home, and to not carry them onto British soil. It is an open secret that the credit of the smart capture belongs entirely to the well-known Scotland Yard officials, Messieurs Lestrade and Gregson. The man who was apprehended appears in the rooms of a certain Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who has himself, as an amateur, shown some talent in the detective line, and who, with such instructors, may hope in time to attain some degree of their skill. It is expected that a testimonial of some sort will be presented to the two officers as a fitting recognition of their services. Didn't I tell you so when we started? Said Sherlock Holmes with a laugh. That's the result of all our study in Scarlet, he said the thing. To get them a testimonial. Oh, never mind, I answered. I have all the facts in my journal, and the public shall know them. In the meantime, you must make yourself contented by the consciousness of success, like the Roman miser. Populus missibilat, mihi plaudo, ipsi domi sumulac numus competero in ire. I don't know why the book ended with a Latin quote or Roman quote, excuse me. But I guess we got our answers. We found the murderer. We did everything. We have finished the final story, or the final part of all that stuff. Definitely a story. Not exactly the world's most thrilling story, I know, but the murderer, absolutely. I don't think the good guy always wins. Look at this stupid squirrel. This squirrel in the game is just attacking me. Get out. It was good. I enjoyed it. That was fun. What time? 10:15. I think it is about time for bed. I'm enjoying this. The Roardiobooks. I'm thinking about getting into some form of voice acting or voice reading or voice thing. So this might be more of a thing. I might be reading more current-y books coming up in the future, but definitely just a new thing. I'm definitely going to be doing streams some more, but a new kind of. And I hope that won't be too much. But thanks for coming out. I think I'm going to go away. That was a fun book. See you later, Brainbuster. Bye, Kitty, if you're still awake. Bye, anybody else. Good night.
Thanks for your time. Have a good day.